Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm going to slip this down
Okay.
because I'm isolated up here. And I don't want to pass out halfway through class this morning.
We don't want to. Yeah, you get pretty winded up there, don't you?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes. Oh, goodness. Well, it's not a happy experience to be back in masks. But, I guess the way that I'm looking at this is it's a way that I can help protect some of my brothers and sisters in this room that have, specific conditions that make it risky for them. So that's the way I'm doing it. Okay. We are continuing in chapter 7 of John today. You'll recall from our discussion last week as we started into this section that we are now about 6 months before the end of Jesus' earthly ministry. And between chapters 7 and 10, we will see a number of encounters that Jesus has with the authorities in Jerusalem. And this is the first of those that occurs during the Feast of Tabernacles. John is the only gospel writer that tells us of these events. And so we start off with the occurrences, and this would be, again, the fall before Jesus' final Passover that will come in the spring. And so as Jesus teaches in chapter 7, we've divided this section into 3 parts. Verses 1 through 13, which we talked about last week, is basically everybody is anticipating Jesus' arrival. When we get to verse 14 and we run with that through verse 36, that will be Jesus' teaching at the Feast of Tabernacles. And then when we get to verse 37 to the end of the chapter, verse 52, we will look at the final day of the feast. And we'll talk specifically about some of the practices of the Feast of Tabernacles, and that'll all be next week when we get there. But today we are looking at, what we talked about last week then was this first 13 verses of the chapter where everyone is anticipating Jesus' arrival in Jerusalem. And his family, of course, tried to get him to go there, and Jesus said, no, the time's not right yet. And so Jesus was delaying his arrival, seeking the right time. But meanwhile, those that are in Jerusalem and those who have gathered there for the feast are eager for him to show up for various reasons. For the leaders, for the Jewish leaders, the Jewish religious establishment, they are now openly seeking an opportunity to arrest Jesus. They want to end his ministry. They want to end his, what they view as heresy, and they want to simply kill him. They're looking for any opportunity to do that. And as they do that, and that's their attitude toward Jesus, they're intimidating the common people. And the common people are afraid to speak up because of what the leaders of the Jews are saying and what they're doing. But meanwhile, the crowds, it's not a one-size-fits-all. There are some in the crowds who are coming to believe in Jesus, which one might expect. And they recognize his uniqueness, that there's nobody like him. And we can read in verse 12 that they are saying, and they're whispering to one another, he's a good man. So they're thinking, well, this Jesus guy is okay. But there are other people in the crowd who see him as a fraud and as a deceiver of the people. And that you can see at the end of verse 12 in chapter 7 as well. Okay, and so now Jesus arrives. And he arrives in the middle of the week, in the middle of the festival. And what's going on is, I've got a bunch of F words. It's festive. It's frenetic. I mean, there's so much activity. Things are just crazy in Jerusalem. Remember, these people had to build shelters for themselves to live in for the week. And, it's just, there's so much hustle and bustle. It's fanatical. You're seeing Judaism at its highest, at its peak. Josephus told us, recall from last week, that the Feast of Tabernacles was the greatest and the grandest and the holiest of all the feasts of the Jews. And it was a frenzy. And that was what Jerusalem was like, and that's how that's what Jesus finds when he arrives there. And now as we look at this section of text, I want for you to watch the religious leaders. Of course, they're opposing Jesus, but watch as they raise technical objections to who he is. They can't compete with Jesus as he teaches, and they can't compete with him on a scriptural level. But what they can do is they'll nip at the corners, they'll nip at the edges. It's like, I can remember being in a medical staff meeting one time, and there was a group who didn't want this meeting to go in a certain direction. And so, I mean, they were trying everything. They were calling for points of order. They were saying, we don't have enough people here for a quorum. We don't have enough people to make this decision. But they were nitpicking at items of order. It reminds me of the musical, The Music Man, and this shyster comes into town, right? And the school board that he gets off singing into a barbershop quartet, but they keep saying, oh, we got to check this guy's credentials out, but they never get around to checking his credentials. And that's what these Jewish leaders are doing. They're checking Jesus' credentials. They can't fight him in Scripture or his understanding of God, but they'll nip around the edges. And so as Jesus arrives, they raise these technical objections to him that are all based on his credentials. So let's read verses 14 through 24. Yeah, so I guess I can say that. And the first one of these objections that they raise is he doesn't have the right educational background. He doesn't really have the schooling that he needs, okay? So let's read 14 through 24 as Jesus arrives, and then they query him on his credentials. Not until halfway through the feast did Jesus go up to the temple courts and begin to teach. The Jews were amazed and asked, how did this man get such learning without having studied? Or in other words, without having attended one of the rabbinical or synagogue schools where he should have gone to get his education. And Jesus answered, my teaching is not my own. It comes from him who sent me. If anyone chooses to do God's will, he will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. He who speaks on his own does so to gain honor for himself, but he who works for the honor of the one who sent him is a man of truth. There is nothing false about him. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet not one of you keeps the law. Why are you trying to kill me? You are demon-possessed, the crowd answered. Who's trying to kill you? And Jesus said to them, I did one miracle, and you are all astonished. And yet, because Moses gave you circumcision, though actually it did not come from Moses, but from the patriarchs, you circumcise a child on the Sabbath. Now, if a child can be circumcised on the Sabbath, so that the law of Moses may not be broken, why are you angry with me for healing the whole man on the Sabbath? Stop judging by mere appearances and make a right judgment. One thing we're going to notice here is Jesus is becoming increasingly confrontational and increasingly direct in his criticism, and he's forcing them into a corner. Verse 8 tells us that Jesus had been awaiting the right time, and apparently he decided that the right time was midweek to arrive. Maybe that was because he knew that the tension and the temperature in Jerusalem was just going up and up and up, and if he waited till midweek, he would get the maximum exposure. Maybe that had something to do with it. But he arrives in Jerusalem, and notice that what does he do? He begins to teach. Now there's something missing from what he's been doing in most places. Most of the places that he's been teaching, he's also been doing signs. This time he shows up and he lets his teaching stand on its own. He's not performing the miracles on this occasion. And It's also interesting to me that John does not record the specific teachings. Instead, he records how Jesus responds to their challenges. He doesn't say when Jesus went to the temple, this is what he proclaimed to the crowds. John doesn't tell us that. That information is not available to us here. We don't know what the content of Jesus' teaching was that he shared on those occasions. But instead, John tells us about how the people, and especially the authorities, reacted to Jesus, and then how Jesus countered back to them. So, in verse 15, where we see the Jews that were being amazed, those are the leaders and the authorities. This is not the general crowd. These are the authorities. And their chief concern in verse 15 is, where did he study? Is he just coming here on his own? Or does he have somebody standing behind him as his mentor, as his teacher? What school's he from? For Jews, the source of one's teaching and the schooling you had received was incredibly important. It was as important as having an Ivy League degree behind your name, for example. It was, you can recall phrases from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus addressed a number of issues, and he said, "You've heard this, but I say that." And he applied that to a number of different situations. But that was a contrast from what Jewish teaching usually sounded like, because what Jewish teaching would typically sound like was something like this. Okay, here's the topic we're looking at today, and Rabbi Akiva, back 100 years ago, said this about that. And Rabbi Hillel, back 200 years ago, said this about that. And my teacher, Gamaliel, said this about that. And that was the way Jews propped up their evidence and propped up their thoughts, was with this citing of their sources and their teachers. But Jesus comes in, and it looks to the Jews like he's just off on his own. He's not teaching in the way that they are used to. Well, Jesus responds, of course, to that. And he says, essentially, in verses 16 through 19, he says, my source is God himself. That's my source. And so, Jesus once again identifies the Father, God, as being his teacher. Lost my place. There we go. And that he was not a graduate of any theological or rabbinical school. Then Jesus, in verses 17 and 18, offers two proofs for why he is not operating on his own. Okay? The first of those proofs has to do with the heart of the one being taught, the heart of the student, the heart of the learner. And what Jesus says in verse 17 is, if anyone chooses to do God's will, he'll find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. In other words, the only people who are going to be able to figure out if I'm really from God are those who are intending to follow the teachings. If you're just interested in this as an intellectual exercise, you will not get it. And you know what? Jesus' teaching was always like that. You remember, why did Jesus teach in parables? Jim says it was difficult to understand the parables, and they certainly were. Even his disciples had to ask him for the interpretations. And so there was always going to be a subset of the people who would get it, and a subset of the people who wouldn't get it. And you had to be engaged and involved if you were going to understand the teachings of Jesus. And so Jesus' teaching always brought about this divide, this division. In saying what he says here in verse 17, Jesus essentially limits his audience. He says, the only ones I'm serious about here are those who are trying to follow me. Okay? those are the ones who will see my teaching and be able to understand whether it's truthful or not. I can remember, and maybe you do too, there was a scene in a movie a long time ago, I'm going to date myself, but Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. And Indiana is chasing the Holy Grail, and they come to that chasm, that cliff, where it looks like it's a bottomless pit that he's in danger of stepping into, and he's got to find a way across this thing. And how does he get across it? Well, he finds I can't remember the phrase or the clue or the scripture or whatever it was, but it was, I can remember one of the other ones, but I can't remember that one. But anyhow, there was something saying you've got to just take the first step.
That's right.
And it shows him just standing there on the edge of this precipice, and finally he gets up the courage to take that step, fully expecting to fall into the abyss, and the path across appears. And you know what? There's a lot of faith relevance to that idea, because it takes just simple faith to step out sometimes, and a desire to serve and honor God and do His will, and it's in doing that that the path becomes clear, and it becomes obvious that it's the right path. And that's what Jesus is saying, and John is recording for us. He says, if one chooses to do God's will, then he will find out whether the teaching is mine or not, whether the teaching is God's or not. So it requires faith on our part. And that's an important principle of Christian growth and development, is that we must take that first step. And if we are, it's a great reinforcement of our faith, right? But if we never take that first step, we just think, well, that was impossible. Forget it. I'm walking away from this. Not going to do it. And so Jesus' teaching brings us to a fork in the road. And this is what Jesus is talking about here in verse 17. But in his second proof that he offers is that who gets the credit for what's being said here? Does the student who's delivering the message, or is it the teacher who gets the credit? If the student's getting all the credit, chances are he's working on his own. But if he's giving all the credit, all the glory to his teacher, then it's legit. And that's what he says here in verse 18. He who speaks on his own does so to gain honor for himself. But he who works for the honor of the one who sent him is a man of truth. There is nothing false about him. And so Jesus throughout has been consistently deflecting the spotlight away from himself and back to his Father. He's always talking about his Father. My Father wants this. My Father is this. My Father desires this. My Father has given me this. My Father, my Father, my Father. And he always points to his Father. And so Jesus, in saying this, challenges them to find any instance wherein he has been promoting himself. And they can't. There's nothing. Jesus only tries to glorify his Father. And we see that throughout John's text here. In verse 19, Jesus points out that they are not seeking God's will. So what we were talking about in verse 17, those who will choose to know God's will and do it, those are the ones who will learn. Well, he goes on in verse 19 to say, you are not keeping the law. You don't know it. You are not seeking God's will. You are rejecting me, and you're also rejecting Moses. Because one of the commandments that Moses gave was, thou shalt not kill. And here you are trying to kill me. And so he blows up their plot right in front of them. And he blows it up. And verse 20 tells us, though, that not everybody's aware of this plot, and they think, what is Jesus talking about? So there's the group who knows what they're doing, and they're trying to get rid of Jesus. But in verse 20, we see there's a part of the crowd that says, wait a minute, what are you talking about, Jesus? Are you crazy? Are you just paranoid? What's going on here, Jesus? And what's interesting about this is that while here in the Feast of Tabernacles and in the fall, the crowd is not aware of the plot, and they're trying to talk Jesus down. In 6 months from now, on Passover, it will be the crowd who is yelling, "Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him." And that will be the change that brings about Jesus' death ultimately. So they will later rush to judgment. Verses 21 through 24 now, Jesus sort of concludes this little section, and he talks about what had happened back in chapter 5. He speaks about that one miracle, and he says, because of that one miracle, you are all, and he uses a word, astonished. But the word the Greek word there is a word that is not astonished in a good way. It's being astonished in a critical way and thinking there's something wrong with what he did back then, and they were complaining about it. And that's the meaning that's attached to that word. So I did one miracle, and all you have done is complain about it. That's what Jesus is saying in that particular verse. Verses 22 and 23 looks at how the law treated circumcision. So Jesus plucks an example from the law, and he says this is the way Sabbath is to be treated. In order to follow the law of Moses, which in Leviticus chapter 12 and verse 3 tells us that circumcision must be done on the 8th day of life. Okay? And if you're going to follow that, and if the 8th day of life falls on a Sunday, on a Sabbath, you still circumcise them on the Sabbath then. In your mind, you break your Sabbath law in order to fulfill the circumcision law. But what Jesus is saying, there's just one law. It's Moses' law. And it's Moses' law that Moses got from God. And if you're going to keep that law, then the Sabbath takes second place. And what he's teaching us is what he taught us back in chapter 5. That Sabbath was never really about rest and not doing work. It was about keeping the day holy and preserving God as holy and having a special opportunity to honor him. So, Jesus then goes on to say, what's more important? To circumcise somebody or to heal a whole man? And of course, what he had done in chapter 5 was he had changed the guy's life forever. He took a lame man who'd been laying there by the pool for decades and made it so that he would now walk. Wow. You talk about, and if it's important enough to circumcise a child on the 8th day, what about healing this man and making his life change forever? And that's what Jesus is holding up there. And he climaxes it with this sort of pithy statement in verse 24. Stop judging by mere appearances. Stop looking at the way things look and make a right judgment. A more literal translation will say, do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. You hear the word judge in there a few times? Yeah. And it's because we have to make those types of decisions. Making right judgments, then, is not just a matter of checking the list of what's permissible on Sabbath and checking the boxes. That's not what it's about. It's not superficial box checking. It's not running Jesus out of town because he doesn't have the right credentials. It's not because he doesn't follow the Sabbath law in the way that you want him to follow the Sabbath law. Take a look at 2 Corinthians chapter 3. There's a little statement here that's a perfect parallel. 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 6. The text says, I just want to read the last phrase of the text. The letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. The Jews in John chapter 7, John chapter 5, those Jews are judging by the letter. and they're looking for the box beside the letter of the law that they can check off to say yes or no. And that was the extent of their seeking righteousness. Instead, what Paul writes here in 2 Corinthians, the letter kills, the Spirit gives life. And in John's terminology, he's saying that Jesus is looking for those who will judge by using Spirit-led motives and Spirit-led wisdom and Spirit-led actions. And that is the person, that is the way that we need to be extending our judgment, is with the guidance of the Spirit. So once again, what Jesus says here, to cap this all off, is stop judging by mere appearances and make a right or righteous judgment. The other thing that we want to see in this is that, and I've been thinking about this a lot the last few weeks, because we're quite a ways now, not in pages, but in time. It's been a long time since we looked at the prologue. But I've been thinking recently about how the prologue to the book of John really sets up everything that happens in the book. And when I think of what Jesus is teaching here, I think of verse 17 in the prologue. The law was given through Moses. John 1:17. The law was given through Moses. And that law was something, it was a tool that could only bring guilt and death. It could never make one righteous. We see that in the book of Hebrews. And then John goes on at the last half of verse 17 to say that grace and truth come through Jesus Christ. And so what Jesus is bringing to the law is an element of grace and an element of the truth about God and what God's character is really like. It's not a rigid box-checking exercise. That's not what it's about. And unfortunately, it's a great temptation for religious groups and people both to fall into that box-checking exercise. Okay. Whew. The second objection that they level on Jesus, we talked about the first objection being his educational background. The second objection that they level is that of his origin. Where did he come from? Did he come from the right place? Did he come from the places that we expected? And this gets interesting because as you read through the rest of the chapter, we come to realize that people had a lot of different expectations about Jesus. Some expected him to come from, some expected him to come with no background at all. Some expected him to come from Bethlehem and from the lineage of David. The only thing that they can get together is nobody expected it to come from Galilee. That's the only thing we can really get it together. But his origin becomes the next problem for them. So let's read 25 through 36. At that point, some of the people of Jerusalem began to ask, "Isn't this the man they're trying to kill? Here he is, speaking publicly, and they're not saying a word to him. Have they really concluded that he is the Christ? But we know where this man is from. When the Christ comes, no one will know where he is from." Okay, there was this prevailing idea that Jesus, or that the Messiah, when he arrived, would be originless. Nobody would know where he came from. And then Jesus, still teaching in the temple courts, cried out, "Yes, you know me, and you know where I am from. I'm not here on my own, but he who sent me is true. You do not know him, but I know him, because I am from him, and he sent me." And at this they tried to seize him, but no one laid a hand on him, because his time had not yet come. Still, many in the crowd put their faith in him. And they said, "When the Christ comes, will he do more miraculous signs than this man?" The Pharisees heard the crowd whispering such things about him. And then the chief priests and the Pharisees sent the temple guards to arrest him. Jesus said, "I'm with you for only a short time, and then I go to the one who sent me. You will look for me, but you will not find me, and where I am you cannot come." The Jews said to one another, "Where does this man intend to go, that we can't find him? Will he go where our people live scattered among the Greeks, and teach the Greeks, or the Gentiles? What did he mean when he said, 'You will look for me, but you will not find me, and where I am you cannot come'?" All right, so verses 25 through 27. Obviously, some of the people in the crowds are aware. We just saw in verse 20 that some of them weren't aware that the leaders were trying to kill him. But some in the crowds were aware of the leaders' intention to kill Jesus and silence him. And they're confused. Why are our leaders tolerating him? Why are they letting him continue to go on with this teaching, this heresy, and do it publicly in the temple with such attention? Have they really sort of secretly decided that he is the Christ? Well, no, he can't be, because he doesn't have the right credentials. He doesn't come from the right place. When the Messiah comes, we're not going to know where he's from. And you can see this idea back in Matthew chapter 24. Matthew 24, starting in verse 23 and reading through 27, says this. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, here's the Messiah, or there he is, don't believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive even the elect, if that were possible. See, I have told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, there he is out in the desert, do not go out. Or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. And what Matthew is describing here, what Jesus is describing and Matthew records, is this idea that the Son of Man will appear suddenly without warning, and it will be visible to everybody. Well, they knew Jesus' background. They knew he grew up in Nazareth. They knew his parents, or his parent and a half, Mary and, of course, Joseph. And so he doesn't meet their expectations as to his origin. So why then were the authorities allowing him to continue teaching? Why didn't they just go ahead and arrest him? Because of the crowds. The crowds haven't changed yet. They will 6 months from now, when the leaders make these same types of propositions. The crowds will say, crucify him, crucify him. But they're not to that point yet. They haven't gotten there. And so the leaders are kept from doing their deeds because of the popular appeal that Jesus had, in all likelihood. Verses 28 and 29, Jesus responds to those questions about his origin. And it's interesting to notice in verse 28 that the text tells us that Jesus didn't say this, he cried it out. And what that looks like is a prophet, an Old Testament prophet, who is, number one, it's loud, but it's also offensive, and it is prominent. It's a message that Jesus does not want them to miss. It's a loud prophetic proclamation. And he says, you know me and where I come from, but they only knew him in a physical sense. They didn't know, and they didn't realize, they didn't believe that he came from God. Not as a group anyhow. They only knew that he was from Nazareth of Galilee. And they failed to recognize that he was from heaven. Because he goes on to say, I am not here on my own, but he who sent me is true, and you do not know him. But I know him because I'm from him, and he sent me. Because they are rejecting Jesus, they're rejecting the Father once again. The key phrase in his discussion here is in verse 28 when he says, you do not know him. And of course he's talking about God himself. And Jesus is appealing for them to believe the message that he's trying to speak so that they can know God and that they can know what Jesus is revealing about him. Verses 30 through 32, some attempt to seize Jesus at this point. And again, look at I think it's the first word in all of our translations. Some of them, or the first word or group of words, some say at this, and some say so. But what it's saying is that the action of verse 30 is linked to what Jesus said in verse 29. So because Jesus said, I know him, you do not know him, but I know him because I'm from him and he has sent me. And because Jesus said that, They decide it's time to seize him. And they think now they have a basis to arrest him. What is the basis for their arrest? If they proceed on this track, what are they going to arrest Jesus for? Blasphemy. Once again, he's putting himself on God's level. That's right. Exactly. It's a blasphemous statement, unless it's true. Right? And so once again, we see the polarization that we've talked about the last several weeks. This polarization is just increasing. Some are attempting to seize him, but then there are others who in verse 31 say, when the Messiah comes, when he shows up, will he do more than this guy's doing? How can that be? And so there are others who are still wanting to put their faith in Jesus. Meanwhile, the chief priests and the Pharisees actually send out the temple guards to take Jesus. Okay, a lot of us, and I'm guilty of this too, I've read this, I'm sure, several times, but if you were to ask me, when did they try to arrest Jesus, I would probably say the last Passover. But this is 6 months before that. The Pharisees are sending out a team to apprehend him. Okay. The thing is, what we read here about Jesus crying out, this is Jesus throwing gas on the fire. Because now he's forcing the Pharisees to take action and begin to put into motion the steps that they've been planning for a while. In verses 33 through 36, and we'll conclude with this morning, Jesus makes this prophetic statement about his future. And essentially he says, I will be resuming the place where I came from. I will be going back to the place where I came from. And you won't be able to see me then. I will be with you. I will only be with you for a short time. Then I will go to the one who sent me. You will seek me, but I will be unfindable. And so some of the people that are there wonder if that means that Jesus is going to disappear into the Gentile world. And is he going to become like the Jews of the dispersion, the Jews who had left Jerusalem and never came back? Is he going to be like that? And in that sense, this statement becomes a bit prophetic because, of course, the church does move out into the Gentile world because of the rejection of the Jews. But that's not the primary message of this passage. The primary message of this passage is that as individuals, people will seek Jesus, and he won't be available to them directly. He won't be living with them anymore. And that's the primary message of this passage. And I want to leave you with one thought here, and that is this passage ends up getting fulfilled for both of Jesus' target audiences. For his disciples, this passage gets fulfilled because they want Jesus there. They want his leadership. And he knows they're going to miss him later on. And of course, he's going to give them the Holy Spirit to sustain them over time. But his disciples and those who believe in Jesus are going to look for Jesus for that reason. But the others, even Jesus' opponents, this is going to be fulfilled for them too, because the time is going to come, as it did in Acts chapter 2, when they turn around and say, what have we done? How do we get out of this mess? And so those who are plotting and planning to put him to death, this is going to come true for them too. They are going to look for him because they will need him to escape the judgment that will come for the actions they are about to take. So it's fascinating that Jesus offers this prophecy, and I've always looked at it one-dimensionally for the believer, but it's also fulfilled for his opponents and for the unbelievers who were working against him too. So that's what we see happening here in the middle section of chapter 2. We see, just to review quickly, we see the crowds challenging him on the basis of his credentials. First of all, on the basis of who his message is from and where his teaching comes from. And then secondly, on the basis of where he himself came from. What was his origin? And Jesus refutes both of those. And now next week, we're going to get into this business, and it starts in verse 37, when Jesus, on the last and greatest day of the feast, he stood and said in a loud voice with a commanding presence, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink." And what we're going to see is, I'm going to tie this together with what we introduced last week, and that is the Feast of Tabernacles, by this point in history, included an important water ceremony. And Jesus applies that water ceremony directly to himself. So it's not just Passover that Jesus applies to himself. He also applies the Feast of Tabernacles in this water exercise. So that's what we'll be talking about next week. Thank you for your attention and your attendance. Don't forget, God is good.